St. Peter's.
So Bob, we're gonna, of course, always start with our map so we can just get everybody acclimated for those who have never been to Italy or to Rome and to Vatican City. We begin always to acclimate people to the lay of the land. Here's Rome. And of course, like all major cities in the world today, in these modern worlds, we have a ring road around Rome. And the little tiny stamp that Bob refers to it is Vatican City. Very close to the airport, only an hour drive with traffic, about a 40-minute drive without traffic. And here is Rome. You can see Vatican City on your left. And then the furthest point that we have pointed out is the Basilica of St. John Lateran, and that is only a 5K, so it's 3.1 miles. It's an easy walk. Many people walk around Rome simply because it's so difficult to get into to the city center. And the Spanish Steps from the Vatican is about 1.5 miles. It's not so far. And here we are. The beautiful facade and piazza of St. Peter's Basilica, which, and if you did not see the pilgrimage last week, Dr. Bentz gave a wonderful explanation, spiritual explanation of the layout of this beautiful piazza. And on our YouTube channel, you can watch that. It's something not to miss.
So Deb, can you explain why do you show that photo there of Mary?
Well, you can take it, Bob.
No.
Well, the photo of Mary, the mother of the church, Multi Ecclesiae, is because it's the only color in the piazza, and it was recently added under the pontificate of John Paul after he was assassinated.
Well,
excuse me?
Attempted assassination.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. Attempted. So he realized that there was not an image of Mary, the mother of our church. And so there is a chapel in the back of the basilica that has this image. And it was it was originally called the Altar of Our Lady of the Column. And it was a column from the original Constantinian basilica that someone had written, as they say, for an icon of Mary on the column. And they took that column and they put it in this chapel. And it is the only painting in the Basilica of St. Peter, except for there are 2 paintings and Dr. Bentz will probably know better than me. There are 2 paintings in the Eucharistic Adoration Chapel, correct?
If there are no paintings, what are all those images in the basilica?
Mosaics. It's amazing.
Mosaics.
So
Okay.
this particular image during the Vatican II Council was named by Pope Paul VI as Mary, the Mother of the Church, and that chapel was renamed. And so because when Pope John Paul II said, we need an image, he thought, of course, that's the perfect image. That is the image of Mary, the Mother of our church. And there it is. And it's always lit up at night. It's just so beautiful.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the Sistine Chapel. And then here is just the same layout, just so people can have a sense of the basilica, a sense of the very large size of the piazza, and where the Vatican museums are.
We might say, where did the popes live and where does Pope Francis live?
Okay.
Can you explain that?
So where you see the papal window for the Angelus that's being pointed out, that is the papal palace. The palace actually walks, there's a courtyard to the left of that. So the building that's for the papal palace, and then the backside, and then the other to the left. So there is a courtyard there, and that is where the popes were. That top floor was Pope. That's where we would see Pope Benedict's lights on, and then we would all who live around there and work around there, we would see the light go out. We would all say, "Oh, Papa's asleep now." Mm-hmm. So it was very sad when that was no longer. But Pope Francis chose to stay in the Domus, and if you look where the Paul VI auditorium is, just behind that, you really cannot see it in this photo. It's to the back, just to the back of that on the left, directly behind it on the wall is where the Domus Santa Marta is.
Okay, excellent. The Pope Francis does come over to the Apostolic Palace to have different meetings, sometimes with presidents, but otherwise it's empty a lot of the time.
An interesting point, Bob, there is he does have meetings with presidents at the Apostolic Palace, but the amazing thing is that he reserves his most important guests to his residence at Santa Marta. I was always surprised that when Queen Elizabeth, for example, visited Pope Francis, he had her for tea at Santa Marta. And I must say, my mother as well. My mother was anointed by Pope Francis in his very residence. And he often says he reserves that spot for his most special guests.
And actually it's a pilgrim house, so all of us someday may have a chance to visit that pilgrim house, Domus Santa Marta. Remember Martha and Mary. Martha was very busy and helping guests. That's why it's a guest house. Mary was contemplating Jesus. And Jesus said, Mary, you have chosen the better part. So Domus Santa Marta, where Francis lives now. Jan, here we are looking down over the piazza from the cupola of St. Peter's.
Yes, indeed. And thank you again, and welcome everyone to part two. So thank you, Deborah, for putting this together. We had very positive feedback from the last tour, and so I'm very happy to be back in St. Peter's. There's a lot here, so it gave us great opportunity to have a second part of this tour. Deborah put this together, so I'm very thankful, even though you had lots on your mind. And so thank you, Bob, also for having me again. And also, obviously, for everyone who's listening, who's tuning in. Yes, I think we're going to do a little bit of both today, right? We're going to be pilgrims, but also trying to contemplate some spiritual features of our faith and that touch upon or that we can see in the arts in St. Peter's Basilica. So the last tour, I'm not going to repeat what I said, and as Deborah already pointed out, you're welcome to watch the first part, which is on YouTube on the Inside the Vatican channel. But I do want to reference one thing. Maybe we talked about the pilgrim coming down, in the modern pilgrim, most importantly, coming down that big street that you see here in the center top, the Via Conciliazione, right? So the road of reconciliation. It was a historical reconciliation that was named after, but I think we can also talk about the spiritual reconciliation. So the cleansing, and we talked a little bit about that. Entering the piazza, you are being cleansed from everything that is worldly, right? From everything that is sinful or potentially sinful anyways, to really orient your mind towards God. So I think we can now pass into the Basilica and kind of approach the gate, if you will. Oh, there's another good shot.
Right. And this, I think it was 1993. Is that correct? About that year is when Mussolini removed those homes.
No. It would have been about 1933.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did I say?
Mussolini came to power in 1922 until the end of the Second World War, 45. And in the 1930s, he removed those houses that were in that street. And and Jan, you gave a beautiful explanation. I don't know if you could repeat that. The pilgrim used to come up that way.
Sure. Yes, the pilgrim came up that way and would approach the Basilica, and you would go through this forest of buildings. So you would go through, and if you've been to Rome, it's very typical. So there are some roads that are just very narrow, and the palaces are very high. So you're literally in darkness. Okay, and imagine this is a time before electricity. So the streets would not be lit up with street lights. You would come through the darkness, and you would approach the square. You would approach the piazza. So the passage from all of those narrow roads, from all of the large buildings into the piazza, was a very stark contrast. And you would step into that open space, to that open welcoming space, and there you would see with clarity being received, right, by the church with her open arms, and the colonnades basically representing the two arms of the church and of Christ receiving you into the church.
So here's where we're going to visit. These are the places we will visit today. We're going to go
Indeed.
to the baptism. Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, no, okay. Either way is fine. So we're going to go through the main gate that is actually not open usually. So we're going to be sneaky about that. We're going to snuck through the main gate. And then we will go on the last tour, we kind of went on the right side. Okay, now we're going to focus on the left side of the Basilica. So we're going to go first to the Baptistry Chapel. I'm going to explain a little bit of the main nave as well. And then we will move on to the altar of the Transfiguration, as well as look at one of the saints on the sides, to kind of skip on the other side, the tomb of Gregory XIII, and then to end in front of the tomb of Alexander VII, and finally in the very front of the Basilica with St. Francis of Assisi. So you can also see we have a lot of saints accompanying us today, as well as what Father pointed out very correctly, the connections of the Rosary. We're going to see a lot of the mysteries of the Rosary today, and the artistic representations. But I think Ignatius, Francis of Assisi, and Jesus himself are going to be our guides through the Basilica today.
Jan, Deb, could you wait 1 second? Could you tell us something about the shape? And I believe this is the largest church in the world, and the shape of the church.
Yes, it's the originally, actually, it was not supposed to be a Latin cross. Now, what it is, if you look closely, it looks maybe a little bit strange, but if you look, seeing the picture as it's laid out here, the foundational plan, so the floor plan of the Basilica is in the shape of a cross, right? So you have a so-called Latin cross, which just means that the main nave is twice as long as the side naves, right? So you actually have a normal cross, as you would hang up on your wall. You would have a normal cross laid on the ground, and that being the floor plan of the Basilica.
Okay.
Jan, I have a question.
Please.
We received some feedback last week, some email, and I don't know if I forwarded this one to you. Someone sent us an explanation how this looks like a key.
Mm-hmm.
And how this is the key, of course, the keys that Jesus handed over to Peter.
Of St. Peter, naturally. One of the two saints actually that receives us before we actually enter the Basilica, outside in the square still, is Peter and Paul, right? And our famous twins here. And so Peter is in the center of attention, naturally, in all of this Basilica. It's his Basilica. So Peter receives in the very famous passage, and Robert very beautifully explained that last tour, the two keys from Christ, the two powers, the powers of the keys, right? The key of heaven and the key of earth, of the hearts of men on earth. And so this explains to him, right, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loosen on earth will be loosed in heaven. So showing that spiritual impact of all of the actions of, well, Peter as a first pope, but then also all of the successors, all of the successive popes. So I think it's also a beautiful image that, and yes, you did. I remember you did send me the email that the Basilica looks like a keyhole, right? And so it is the key of Saint Peter, like unlocking the mystery, right? The mystery of faith. Incidentally, and I think I did not say that during the last tour, so maybe we can repeat it. That's where the Vatican flag colors come from. You see a lot of those two colors in Rome, which is yellow and white. And so yellow and white together represent the keys of St. Peter. It is the one key for heaven, which is gold. And then in heraldry, gold becomes yellow. So the key of heaven, yellow. And you have the key of the hearts of men on earth, which is silver. And silver in heraldry translates to white. Translates to white. So you have yellow and white representing the two keys and the full power of St. Peter. So that's another maybe reference to this idea of the key and the keyhole.
Very good.
My computer's not being as cooperative today. All right. So this is just, I'll let you take this, Jan. This is the door that we're showing which door we're going to go in.
That's right. So we have 5 main doors. Last week, Deborah snuck us in with her contacts in the Vatican through the holy doors. Okay, today we're going to just be more boring and gonna go through the main gate, which is actually not open so often. So I believe it's only open twice a year, and maybe Father knows this better, during Christmas and Easter. Either way, so for the big celebrations of the liturgy, either way, we're going to go through the main gate, which is also the oldest gate, the so-called filarete door, so the main gate of the basilica. Very nice, thank you. So this is again the so-called filarete door, which is done by Antonio Averlino, and his nickname was Filarete. He was from Florence, finished in 1445. Now, the gate, and obviously the history of the material of the gate is impressive, but I think what we should focus on more is the spiritual meaning of a gate. And this seems very basic, okay, and it seems almost silly to think about it that way, but crossing a threshold, going through a gate is actually a very biblical idea, a very New Testament idea. Jesus himself says a lot. Jesus himself says a lot about himself, right? He says a lot of things that he is. He says he's the good shepherd. He says he's the Son of God. He says he's the Savior. He says he's the Messiah. He says he is the way. He says he's the truth. He says he's life. He also says, I am the gate, right? John 10:9. So whoever enters through me will be saved, okay? He will find pasture. And so when we approach the gate, we actually already get a glimpse of Christ. We see that path to the Father, to God that revealed himself, that became incarnate for us, right? And so you have the Son of the Trinity that brings us into the church. He himself is the gate. So when we see the church gate, and this is not just true for St. Peter's, this is really true for any church that you enter to, you see Christ himself. Now that you've been cleansed, what we talked about last year, now you have been purified through your pilgrimage, the very artist pilgrimage that you did barefoot, or at least even with shoes on. It's pretty hard to walk, to Rome. If you ever done a long pilgrimage, I'm sure that you had that experience. So you go and you get cleansed, you get purified of everything worldly, and then you prepare yourself, and then you go through that gate as a last step. So this is the final moment before the glory unfolds. And I don't want to be I don't want to be a downer here. I don't want to be Johnny Raincloud, but a door also then means passage, and passage means also death. So it's the moment of death, right, where everything is closed and you don't see it. And this will be a theme that will accompany us throughout the tour, even at the end of the tour, and I'll explain a little bit about that when we talk about Alexander VII. But death, and then the glory is unfolded. Because we think today that this is all the glory that we're going to get in our life, right? And most of our maybe modern world thinks that we have to enjoy life as much as we can right now because there's nothing after. But a Christian believes exactly the opposite, right? Everything glorious comes after. And so we're going to enter through this gate and then have the glory unfold. But I think before we do that, we do have to look at the gate a little bit more. So so this is the main gate. And I think we have another closer shot of that. Very beautiful. Thank you. Where you can see Pope Paul V. Well, first of all, you see the dedication, right? So this is, as I mentioned, Antonio Averlino o Filarete de Florencia, Opus Antoni de Florencia. So a work of Anthony from Florence, and you can see a cross and a little fleur-de-lis. That's the stem for the city of Florence. And here you have the two most important figures, right? The Salvator Mundi on the left, Jesus teaching, and you have, and we already welcomed her today earlier, the mother of the church, right? The Virgin Mary, also enthroned on the right side. So we have Jesus and Mary welcoming us into the basilica.
You can just see the words in the right hand under Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And Can you see Ave Gratia Plena Dei Tecum? So Ave is hail, gratia of grace or with grace, plena, full. Hail full of grace, the Lord is with you. Written right there on the door. It's the same thing as the Hail Mary. The same things as the words of Gabriel. Anyway, I like to look at the inscriptions. I don't want people to be afraid of these inscriptions. On the other side is Salvator Mundi, Savior of the world. And at the top, you can see Paulus V, Paul V, Pontifex Maximus, restauravit, restored, in the year of his pontificate XV, Anno Pontificis XV, 15, the 15th year of his papacy. So all over the place you find these inscriptions, and if you take them slowly, you can often read them.
Very true. The next image, I think, will give us the two other images. And here we re-encounter our two friends again. So on the left, we have St. Paul, and St. Paul carries his sword and the letters that he wrote because he was beheaded. That's his martyrdom. And oftentimes martyrs having the martyrdom as the greatest witness to their faith in Christ carry the instrument of their martyrdom. That's actually how you can recognize them easiest, I think, in art. And then on the right, you have St. Peter. Now, St. Peter also bears a book in his hands, his letters, and then you have his keys in his right hand, kind of dangling down, and you have a tiny figure. And I think this is resonating a little bit iconography, where important figures are very large and less important figures are a little bit smaller. You have more extreme examples of that elsewhere in Rome, but nonetheless, here you can see a smaller figure kneeling to the feet of St. Peter, and that is the person who commissioned the door, Pope Eugene IV. Now, he is kneeling, kissing Peter's hand, right, and receiving the keys. Now, yeah. So on the right there, you can see him. And the Pope has the tiara on, right? Now, this is a detail from the lower frieze. And so this is hearkening back to the two martyrdoms of the saints. We have Peter and Paul. And so this now is St. Paul kneeling down with his eyes blindfolded, being decapitated. So you can see just in the center, you can see a man with a sword behind his back, right? Opening the strike to behead St. Paul. St. Peter and St. Paul, and I said this, but it may be worthwhile repeating, according to the tradition, were martyred on the same day. St. Paul was beheaded outside of Rome because he was a Roman citizen, so it was a privilege to be beheaded in private, fundamentally, so not in a stadium, and also being beheaded, which is a relatively quick death. Terrible death, but still, nonetheless, a quick death. And so we can see that scene here. And in the next frieze, we can see paired the martyrdom of Saint Peter. And so we have Peter crucified upside down. He did not want to die as his master, right? In the kind of left upper part, in the very shiny part. And then you have Emperor Nero sitting on the right side in his imperial box, fundamentally. So here we go. We have Christ and Mary, we have Peter and Paul, and then the martyrdoms of that church. Those are the 6 panels.
Well, thank you, Jan. That was the best explanation I've ever had of that door. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, when you go on a pilgrimage, and I did mention this last time, but when you go on a pilgrimage, you are received into as a goal where you go, and you're going to heaven. And this is, I read once a very beautiful philosophical meditation, what the difference is between a tourist and a pilgrim. And the difference is that the tourist doesn't really leave. He goes in a circle. He leaves and then he goes back where he came from. And so there is a path on the way, he takes pictures, whatever, sure, but he returns to where he comes from, where he came from. The pilgrim has a destination. The pilgrim ends somewhere. It's a linear process. So I find that very beautiful. And so the linear process, the end point, the final end, the final goal of our pilgrimage today is obviously St. Peter's Basilica, and more importantly, the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, which is where ultimately we will encounter God. Now, now we have been cleansed, okay, outside, we have been cleansed, we have gone through the gate, so we have been received by Christ, we have accepted Christ, okay. The next step is we get our first sign of reward, and the first symbol of reward is symbolized by that slab of red porphyry marble right in the center of the basilica. Now, according to tradition, that is a spot in the church where Charlemagne was crowned. In the old church, it was in a different place, but nonetheless, that piece of porphyry marble was kept, and it was actually a very important marble in itself, because the marble in ancient times, this particular marble, so this porphyry, this red marble, was only used by the emperor. It was actually only allowed to be used by the emperor, so on the penalty of death. Only the emperor could use it, and so the emperors did. But just to show their power, obviously. But the church has this different symbolism. The church doesn't care about imperial worldly powers, but the church retained that symbol of imperial glory. And where does the church put that? Where does the church put imperial, like worldly imperial glory? To your feet. You step on it. No matter where you come from, no matter who you are, you're going to step on that worldly imperial glory. You know why? Because in the face of God, you are all equal. If you're emperor, if you're a blacksmith, if you're a senator, if you are a barber, if you work in a shop, if you, I don't know, sell vegetables, if you're a farmer, you're all the same. In the face of God, you have all the same value. And so this slab of marble on the floor there reminds us of that.
You explained the door at the beginning.
Deb, could we look at that just for one more second? That porphyry stone where Charlemagne was crowned was Christmas Day 800. So people can remember that rather easily. Just remember the year 800 on Christmas Day, Charlemagne came to Rome, was crowned emperor. But what emperor? He was crowned Roman emperor. So it was the recreation of the Roman Empire, which had disappeared for almost 400 years. And they, in their time, of course, were in the present. They were thinking, this is very dramatic. We've got this barbaric Frank who's going to become the Roman emperor. But because he was crowned by the Pope, he became the Holy Roman Emperor. And it became what we call medieval Christendom, founded that day, Christmas Day 800. And it lasted right up until about, what would I say, the end of the First World War, with the overthrow of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. And one of the great results of the First World War was the overthrow of all the Christian monarchs, in particular in Russia, the Tsar, and in Austro-Hungary, the last successor of the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is the beginning of 1,100 years of a Holy Roman Emperor, that stone. And so I appreciate stopping here for a moment, thinking about all those centuries. Thanks.
Indeed. Now, on our itinerary, we're going to take a left turn, and we're going to go to the first chapel mirroring the Pieta. Now, the Pieta in itself, as we've seen, is a marvelous piece of work. So you can listen to that in the other recording. But we're going to go to the Baptistry. So let's go to the Baptistry, and that's the Baptistry Chapel. Now, what is fascinating about this chapel is that Julius II rebuilt St. Peter's Basilica. So what we see today is actually the new basilica, the old basilica going back to the time of Constantine and Pope Sylvester I. Now, when he rebuilt it, 1504, if I'm not mistaken, he had to raise the old basilica to the ground and level it. But there is one spot, at least that's the only spot that I know of, that has the original depth of floor, and that is the baptistry. So if you actually look at that baptismal font on the bottom, which looks very, very glorious, very Baroque, so it maybe doesn't even look like a baptismal font to you, but it is a baptismal font. It's a very large one. It's 4 by 2 meters, which is what, like 12 by 12 by 6 feet, more or less. There you go. It's a baptismal font, but you see it's actually down in the ground. It's actually below the ground that we're stepping on. So what you have is the original floor plan, just again, a little anchor, little historical anchor to the old basilica. Now, why is the baptismal font in the beginning of the church, and why is in the entrance of the church, in the entrance area of the church? Because you need to be baptized in order to receive the grace of faith and in order to enter the church, right? So the baptism is the rite of initiation for a Christian and for a Catholic, naturally. So the first thing you have to do after that purification that you've received outside, your confession, your forgiveness, right? You're received by Christ through the main gate and you're being baptized into the church. This is an incredible, very glorious baptistry. So this was designed by Carlo Fontana, one of the kind of great architects of Rome, and was realized in 1722. So it's pretty recent when compared to the other parts of the basilica. Now, it's also porphyry marble, right? So this imperial theme is staying with us here. It's the same marble, and so you become a son of God by baptism, right? And as last time I checked, Christ was also king. So if you become the son of a king, you become a prince. Therefore, you're part of the quote-unquote imperial family, of the Holy Family that is Christ's children. So on top you have that beautiful gilded bronze cover, and that reminds us of, it doesn't remind us, it shows us two very important symbols that we find all throughout art, but also in this basilica, which is one, the Trinity. And so that's in the very center. Okay, there is a globe, there's the globe of the world, and then you have like a dove with rays coming from it as a sign of the Holy Spirit. You have Jesus Christ and you have God the Father all together blessing the earth. So through baptism, grace descends down onto earth. And so we are now the receiver of that grace, being baptized, in this baptismal font. And then you have another very interesting, and I'm sorry we can talk about this long, I'm just going to mention it here in passing, a very interesting symbol from the New Testament, which is the apocalyptic lamb. Okay, so Jesus Christ as the Lamb of God, and you can see him enthroned on top of this baptismal font cover, right? So there's a little lamb, which is the highest kind of point of that work of art. Now, we can also look briefly on the altarpiece, which is behind it, and that is Jesus being baptized in the Jordan. And this should sound familiar because we just prayed the numerous mysteries of the Rosary, of which one is naturally Christ being baptized in the Jordan.
And of course, again, that's a mosaic. It's hard.
Yes. Okay. So I think, yeah. So we have to clarify this. Sorry, and this is a good point. Yes. So and what Deborah said is completely correct. You have a painting in the choir chapel on the left, which we're going to skip today. It's small, but it's nice. But all of the large altar pieces of the side chapels, okay, and they're gigantic. I mean, they're 12 feet, 14 feet high. All of them are mosaic. So they're recreated by Mosaic Studio that the Vatican has. And the Vatican is one of the last places on earth that has that long of a history of mosaic art. And so these are all recreated in mosaic. So tiny, tiny, tiny stones that are glued together, right, to copy the original painting. So there's always an original painting. This particular one here was moved to the Chiesa Nuova, I believe. So there is an original oil painting, but then you have the mosaic here as a copy. And that's going to be the same with the Raphael painting we see later. You'll may be confused because you say, well, I just saw this in the Vatican museums, but there is the original painting. But in the Basilica, you have the mosaic copy. And if I may another contemporary note, oftentimes when the Pope, so Pope Francis, visits or receives important guests, what he usually gives, they have an exchange of gifts, right? When he goes to a foreign country or when he receives an important dignitary, they exchange gifts. And oftentimes what he actually gives as a gift is a mosaic from the same studio that has done all of these copies. Now, these copies are much older, obviously, but the same artists and the same methods are still being used today. Another example of, and maybe we can see this in another tour of the Mosaic Studios, are the panels of the Pope in St. Paul's outside the walls. It's a mosaic of the Pope, a portrait, also done in the same shop. So I think it's worthwhile to talk about this mosaic store.
I think it's interesting as well, Jan, that Mosaic Studio is right next to the residence of Pope Francis, Santa Marta. You can actually visit it, and I often think that he can just pop in and buy the mosaics himself, you know. They cost a few. But one point of the baptistry, Jan, and I'm sure you're about to say this, or if we just look at that baptistry again, and sometimes we wonder, they are really very large, aren't they? And we often see that in many of the basilicas in Rome, these large baptistries. And if I'm not mistaken, the origins is also a sarcophagus of that baptistry. And it really is the symbolism of baptism. You know, in Greek, the word baptizein means to immerse. And it comes very much from Pauline theology, but really the teaching of the church, that when we are baptized, we are literally buried with Christ in order to be raised up anew. And so these baptistries are very large, and in some cases in churches in Rome, I think of San Clemente, there are actually sunken baptistries where the adults could actually go down and be completely immersed, so that the symbolism would really be manifest. One dies to the old man, the old nature, and arises a new person in Jesus Christ. In fact, it's really interesting today that the church still allows immersion and actually says that immersion is the preferred form of baptism. It's interesting. Even though most of us have been baptized simply by sprinkling, the symbolism certainly emerges better when that full immersion takes place.
Well said. Yes, and it does come from an imperial grave from Emperor Hadrian, I believe, so where today's Castel San Angelo is. This is on the floor, if I'm not mistaken, and this is maybe looks familiar if you were very, very attentive to the Marian image outside of St. Peter's. This is the stem of Pope Saint John Paul II, with his motto, right? Totus tuus, all yours. And you can see also his stem is in the color blue, reminiscent of the Virgin Mary, and has an M in it also for Mary. Now, Deborah, if you would not mind taking us back to the shot of the main nave, that would be fantastic. And then we can go to the detail of the wall. Thank you for that. So this is something more general, but this church exemplifies it in a unparalleled manner. So when you go into the main nave, what you are doing, and this again is most eminent when you go into a liturgy celebrated in the Basilica, is you enter heaven. Now, where is heaven here? Well, heaven is up, right? So you look up, and what do you see? You see the ceiling, the vaulted ceiling. Now, the vaulted ceiling is in the colors white and gold. White and gold, whenever you see white and gold or blue and gold in Renaissance art or in Baroque art, it usually means heaven. So what you look at in that beautiful gilded ceiling is, in fact, you look into heaven. Now, our question is, well, how do we get to heaven, right? How do we get to heaven? What do we have to do? So, Deborah, if you don't mind skipping to the baptismal ones and go to the side where you see the wall of St. Peter's. What do we have to do in order to get to heaven? What we have to do is we have to follow the example of the saints. Now, where do we find the saints? One more, I think. Perfect. Next one. Where do we find the saints? Can you go to the next one? We find them in the columns. The columns are the columns of the church, and the church is not a building. It's made up of living stones. And those living stones are the saints. So this whole general main nave allows us to read a little bit of a catechism into it. We go to heaven, we reach that place, that final end of our earthly pilgrimage. We reach that by becoming saints. How do we become saints? We follow the example of saints. Who are the saints? The saints are members of the church who have gone before us and who have lived heroic virtue. Now, St. Peter's Basilica, since it's a very special basilica, obviously did not just choose any saint, and there's many in the Catholic Church, but they choose all founders of religious orders to form the pillars of the church, quite literally. So you have the pillars of the church as examples for your own pathway to sanctity. And so one, I just picked one that I'm sure you all are aware of, so I don't really have to explain him further, which is St. Ignatius of Loyola. So you can see him there. We're going to talk about him in a moment, but let's stay here. So by the example of the saints, we go up to heaven. And what do we have to do? Why are the saints holy? Why are these founders of religious orders, why are they so special? What makes them so special? They lived virtuously. So where are the virtues? Well, the virtues are above the arches. You see those women figures? Women figures in Renaissance art always mean they're symbols, right? They always stand for something. They're not usually not historical figures, but they stand for something. They represent something. So what do they represent? They represent the different virtues, okay? Justice, temperance, fortitude, charity, purity, and so forth. And so by the example of the saints in the pillars, we can emulate their virtue above the pillars, and then we can enter heaven. And so right above that beautiful scripture, which Robert explained last tour very well, we enter into heaven. So this main nave of the church is really representative of our pathway to heaven. And that's how we're supposed to read it, because we're supposed to, after entering through the gate that is Christ, we're supposed to see that heavenly symbolism. Now, this is all still Renaissance, and the church has more than one style of art in it. This is a very Renaissance idea, okay? It's very abstract. You have to know a lot of things to understand it, a little bit like iconology, honestly. Iconography. In the Baroque, it will look different, because if you go into a Baroque church, which we may still on a future pilgrimage, you will actually see the heaven open. You'll see heaven painted on the ceiling. So you actually look into heaven. We don't have that here. It's very abstract, okay? The heaven is gold and white. So you have to know, with a Renaissance mindset, you have to know, those two colors mean heaven, right? Yellow and blue. The stars and the sky mean heaven. So anyway.
Jan, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows where those virtues are. They can see above that rounded arch in the middle, right?
Yes,
we're going to see
correct.
them better in an upcoming photo.
Okay, one other thing, those words above, I always look at the inscriptions, deficiat fides tua. So should your faith, fides tua is your faith. This is Jesus speaking to Peter. He said, should your faith fail, and tu aliquando conversus, and when you then you return, then you will strengthen the faith of your brothers. Because Peter, as we know, denied Christ, and he was sometimes inconstant, but Peter still said he was a rock, because he always would come back to the faith. Conversus there is at the top of the column. When you have returned, when you have been converted, you will then confirm the faith of your brothers. And so this is the role of every pope. Every pope is supposed to be Peter, and whatever weaknesses he has, he's supposed to convert, become steady, and then confirm his brothers. I just wanted to say that. It's written on the basilica walls.
Very good. So there we have a close-up of St. Ignatius. I'm pretty sure that he doesn't need introduction. His motto is printed there in the letters in the book that he has in his hands, which is the rule of the Jesuits, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, so for the greater glory of God, which is the motto of the Jesuits. And then obviously the rule of the Jesuit order is based on his most important written work, which is the spiritual exercises. So the rule of the Jesuits is based on that spiritual exercise, right? Now, Ignatius, by the way, is always very easy to recognize because he's always stepping on a demon. It's always very easy, right? He is the one casting out the demons, snakes, dragons, you have it. So also here you can see the demon with the false teachings, right, in his hands being cast out, and kind of gnawing on his finger, like, oh man, didn't see Ignatius coming. Should have been quicker with my hairs. Anyways, so there you go. There you have Ignatius.
Interesting as well, Jan. Sometimes Pope Francis speaks quite a bit about the devil, and from his very first homilies, but quite a lot, and surprisingly so. But a lot of that really comes from his Jesuit formation, because as we know, Saint Ignatius spoke so much about the discernment of spirits. There are good spirits that lead us into doing good, and there are bad spirits that lead us into doing bad. And discerning them, where they come from, really is key for how we act, and also our emotions, our moods, everything. I think, if you agree, there's some beautiful prayers of Saint Ignatius. Really beautiful prayers, but maybe we could just pray one prayer here that I really love. It'll take just 1 minute as we ponder Saint Ignatius and exactly what you've been saying. It's all about trust in Jesus. O Christ Jesus, when all is darkness and we feel our weakness and helplessness, give us the sense of your presence, your love, and your strength. Help us to have perfect trust in your protecting love and strengthening power, so that nothing may frighten or worry us. For living close to you, we shall see your hand, your purpose, your will, through all things. Amen.
It's beautiful.
Very good. I think we can move on to the altar of the Transfiguration. So you see the virtues with the arrows. Thank you for putting those in. Now we have a perfect vision. Now let's go a little bit further to the altar of the Transfiguration. There it is. Just a couple of steps, really.
We got a chat room notice that the English translation of the inscription on the wall is as follows. And I didn't do it quite correctly, so this is important to correct. Jesus said to Peter, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has desired you, that he might sift you as wheat. But I have prayed the Father for thee, that thy faith fail not. That's the part we were seeing. And thou, being converted, conversus, confirm thy brethren. That's what's written on the wall there. Isn't that stunning? That tension, that crisis of faith, that Satan is trying to sift Peter, and Jesus is praying for him. Okay, sorry.
No, this is very good. Now, this was or is Raphael's masterpiece, really, which is his last work. He died while making it, in fact. So what we see is the Transfiguration of Christ. Raphael died in 1520. He died very young, as some of you may know, with 37, probably of just some minor lung infection. And so this was commissioned by one of the great members of the Medici house. Now again, what we see is not the original painting, but is a mosaic copy. The original painting is in the Vatican museums. But this painting consists of a very important message, and I think it links pretty well to what Robert just said about Satan spreading darkness and spreading temptation. So what you see on this picture, I don't know if we can go a little bit closer to that. What you see on this painting, thank you, is two scenes that are actually detached in the gospel, and they're pulled together by Raphael. One is the Transfiguration proper, which is the top. The lower part is from the Act of the Apostles, and it's a story where a possessed child is brought before the apostles. And so you can see the possessed child on the red bottom with blue pants, naked upper body, stretching one arm to the sky and one arm to the earth. And if you would be able to see even closer, and you couldn't see it closer because you couldn't step further than this because there will be an altar rail, so you couldn't see it if you were even there. But you can see his eyes are a little bit funky, they're a little bit googly. So he is possessed, right? He is between heaven and earth, he is possessed. And so his parents behind him wearing green, the color of hope, are hopeful that he will be saved, or he will be the demons will be cast out by the apostles. So what we have is the apostles in the moment of figuring out what to do. And they're all freaked out, right? Jesus is gone, this is the Act of the Apostles. So Jesus is gone, he is ascended into heaven, he has sent the Holy Spirit. They're going out, okay, they're casting out demons, they're they're exercising, they're baptizing, they're teaching, and they have this moment and they say, okay, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do? And so everyone is kind of in a very agitated motion. Okay, they're pointing in different directions in the painting. They're looking at one another. Peter, there in the left bottom, is checking in the book, like, okay, wait, we had this before, right? Where is the manual? What do we have to do? And so everyone is kind of taken by the situation, but doesn't really know what to do. And then Raphael invites you to look up, and there you have the answer. There you have Christ. And this is something which is really incredible. You have the three most important, most beloved apostles, Peter, right? His brother Andrew, and Peter, James, and John, James and John being blood brothers, right? And so John being the most beloved apostle, Peter being the first of the apostles. So you have them all in that very special moment on Mount Tabor where Jesus shows them who he really is. And it's incredible. This is something that always struck me personally, that Peter denied Christ after having seen him as God. That's incredible. That shows you how weak human beings are. Right? We barely see, Jesus in in our life, in the Eucharist or in faith or in the examples of others, but like Peter has seen Christ as God transfigured and he still denied him. Imagine that, right? What kind of weakness also befell Peter in that moment. Anyways, I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the answer. The answer is Jesus. Jesus as God being transfigured right in the center, and he is there. He is glorious. He is the King of heaven. He has his arms spread out, and he is ready. He is ready to save that child. And what is interesting is that the lower part of the painting or the mosaic in this case, looks very agitated. But if you look up at Christ, Christ is very stable. But the movement on the upper part of the mosaic is actually much more powerful. You have Isaiah and Elijah left and right to Jesus, flying in the air, almost struggling to stay close because Jesus is so powerful that his kind of the radiance, right? It touches them and kind of pushes them away. They have to stay close to Christ. And then the apostles are in the moment of falling down. Right? It's incredible. Like the three, they're falling down, and John is in the moment of falling, like he's just about to hit the ground. So there's a lot of movement there. But the sense that you get is not the one of agitation. The sense that you get, if you look at Christ, is of peaceful rest. So Jesus brings the answer. He brings peaceful rest into a world that is in disarray, into a world in dismay. And I mean, we witness, right, the riots and all of that on the street. So it's easy to now see what Jesus' message really is all about. So the apostles are going crazy about that boy, and Jesus says, guys, come on, we've had this before, right? Follow your faith, follow me. With your faith, you'll be able to save that boy. So Raphael gives us a beautiful little catechism about his own faith. Now, there's much more to say about this, but let's stop here. Now, what you see here, this woman, which is modeled after one of Raphael's girlfriends in Rome, actually, the so-called Fornarina, which just means the baker's daughter. And Raphael was a very handsome young guy. So when he came to Rome, he did not necessarily live an exemplary life all the time. Let's just leave it at that. But you have the Fornarina now sitting model for this, and this is a woman, and this is the virtue of faith. And it's beautiful that that this virtue, and this is if you actually stay here for a second, you can see how through the foreshortening, okay, she's pointing at the boy. Go back to the detail, please. She's pointing exactly at his heart. The finger ends at his heart, right? So he has to receive faith. He has to receive love. Then he will be saved. So she is the channel of all of the apostles, ultimately the channel of Christ's grace through the apostles that gets transmitted into that boy's heart, and that will save him. That will cure him.
The beautiful word, Jan. I see we have Archbishop Sorrentino who's joined us from Assisi. Good afternoon, Archbishop.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Joy to be with you. I was late, sorry, but Jan, my compliments for your explanation.
Thank you, Excellency.
I'm there with you. There with you.
Welcome, Your Excellency. This is also a good photo of the mosaic, where you can see just above her left side of her head, the blue. You can see the actual little pieces of the mosaic, which are very hard to see unless you're in the right light, even inside the Basilica. So this close-up does show how it's magnificent, how they get these details in these mosaics. So onward we go, and we continue to the tomb.
Does everyone know who the Archbishop is? Maybe you should introduce him.
Well, Archbishop Sorrentino is the Bishop of Assisi, and he has been joining us on many of these pilgrimages, and we're just so honored to have him when he can join us.
And Archbishop, you worked at the Vatican years, so you may have a word to give us about St. Peter's Basilica too. So I'm sure you spent many hours there in prayer, and the Transfiguration is really a word about prayer ultimately, but whenever you wish to say a word, you would be very, very welcome, I'm sure.
Thank you, Anthony. Transfiguration is, of course, a mystery of Jesus, but it's also our mystery, because Jesus is transfigured to let each one of us to be transfigured. So what we are going to be in his design, if we follow with faith what he says to us and what he wants from us, so we are to be transfigured like Jesus. So I just want to stress that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Now we're going to make our way over to the other side, so we have to avoid the crowds passing through, and so we're going to stop in front of Pope Gregory XIII. Now, the Vatican Basilica has countless popes. I have to look up how many popes are actually buried there with the monumental tombs, but some of them tell a very special story. So I picked two. And maybe there are other ones to pick, and maybe Robert can fill in as well. I don't know which two you would have picked. I picked two for two different reasons. One is Gregory XIII, which we see here now, and he is a pope of science, and I kind of want to emphasize that. And I want to let you into a very important decision that Pope Gregory XIII decided that he made during his pontificate in the 16th century that still affects you today, okay, up to this day, every day, probably multiple times every day. Now, there was an important cartographer and astronomer, Ignazio Danti, who was a Dominican friar, and he was under the reign of Gregory XIII in charge of all of the sundials in Rome. Now, Rome still at that point had 6 functioning sundials. Now, sundials, as you know, work with the shadow of the sun, right? And then you can tell the time by the shadow of the sun, which obviously presupposes that the sun rises and is in the right constellation, all of that for the sundials to work. Now, Ignazio Danti was a gifted cartographer and astronomer, and so he made many calculations about the sundials because the time was a little bit off, and that led him to actually study the calendar. At that point in Rome and in the world, they used the calendar of Julius Caesar, the so-called Julian calendar. Now, Ignazio Danti had his studies, had his calculations, had his dates, had his calendar studies on the one hand. And then on the other hand, at night, he looked up in the sky and he was looking for the constellations. And people back then didn't have TV, right? So they had nothing to do at night than to look at the stars. So that's what he did. And so he figured out and he said, okay, guys, we have a problem. We have a problem. And so he went to the Pope. He asked for an audience with the Pope. And Pope Gregory XIII granted the audience. He was a lover of all of this knowledge and scientific research. So he invited him in, and now we can see the maybe the detail of the next picture. And so he invited him in, and so we have the moment of that audience where Ignazio Danti with other friars and scientists present the studies to the Pope. And what were these studies about? They were about the calendar. And Ignazio Danti said, Your Holiness, we are behind the stars in our calendar. Our calendar does not correspond to the stars anymore. And the Pope said, okay, well, so, and he says, well, basically we have 11 days. We're 11 days behind. Since the time of Julius Caesar, so in about 1.5 millennium, 11 days have accumulated of being behind the stars. And so Gregory XIII, as a Pope of the Renaissance would say, said that's not a problem at all. So in 1582, you went to bed on October 4th, and you woke up on October 15th, 11 days later. 11 days cut from history. It was still, so the Pope still back then had the power to change time, mind you. So you woke up on October 15th, 11 days were made up for, and now the calculations could fit again to the movement of the stars. That whole thing turned into a new calendar. And that new calendar is called the Gregorian calendar, and is in fact the calendar that you have on your desk or on your wall or in your agenda or in your cell phone. All right, so that's still the calendar that we have. The Orthodox Church, mind you, and Bob will know this much better than I do, still work on the Julian calendar. So that's why also many of the feasts are moved, right? They're 1 week behind, so to speak. So I just wanted to figure that out. And so just to give you a last note on this work of art, because this is one of my favorite moments. If you want to go back to the general of the whole monument, please. Now he was
it's not cooperating.
It's not cooperating. No, he was a Boncompagni Pope, and the Boncompagni family had a dragon, a yellow dragon as their family crest, on a red dragon, a golden dragon on red background. Now, what you see here, and I love this composition, I love it. This shows you the playfulness of Baroque artists. You have the Pope in his majestic, glorious, right, blessing the world kind of position, welcoming everyone, welcoming the scientific research, welcoming all the... You have that, a Pope that really looks into a globalized world, into all of the new continents, into the new continent, the new world being discovered. So he looks at all of that. He wants to spread the faith. He's open, right? You have the two women representing, and I told you, right, women always represent something here. So we have religion on the left. So you have the two slabs of the laws of Moses, right? Now, so the Novi Opera, so the new work by Christ who fulfilled the Old Testament, the New Testament in her hands, and then on the right you have magnificence, one of my favorite papal attributes, magnificence, and you have magnificence with a helmet on, right, leaning on her shield. But magnificence just made a big mistake. Magnificence looked under the bed of the Pope. She literally lifted the cover of that sarcophagus to see if the Pope is really inside. And what does she find? She finds this little cute tiny pet dragon coming out. Right? The red dragon comes out and goes, Row! So now go to the detail. So you have the dragon kind of coming out, right? And you say, don't mess with this Pope, okay? He's very welcoming, but you don't overstep your welcome, because there's going to be a dragon somewhere in there, right? So the dragon comes out, and it's beautiful, just a beautiful playfulness that is so typical of the Baroque, which I just admire. So you can see that whole constellation, and I think it's really unparalleled. Anyways.
Well, I think it's important. Thank you, Jan, for that wonderful explanation. And I just love your passion. It comes through. You've mentioned how Pope Gregory the 13th was the Pope of Science. He was known as the Pope of Science. And I think it's a good time for us to pause and to pray at this tomb, to ask for him to intercede in this period that we are in, where science is being played out, and we need to have morality and good for the human person. Vaccines and things like this that I think of in this time of the pandemic, and for science as we go forth with that, and in other areas as well. So I think we can take a moment, Father, or Your Excellency, if you want to lead us in a prayer here at the tomb of Pope Gregory the 13th.
Archbishop Sorrentino.
Yes, our prayer with a Pope remembers us the importance of the culture, of the sciences, of the Logos, we would say, in Christian way, because what we believe is that Jesus is the Logos, is the Word, so is the intelligence of God. And when we believe in Jesus, we believe also that He is the sense of the world. Everything takes its meaning from Jesus. In ultimate analysis, is Jesus. What we know also in our culture, there are scientists today, and not only today, that, who say, I don't see God in the world. You must have eyes to see God. There is an important scientist, a medical scientist. I read a book recently, the delusion of God. For him, is a delusion, God. But for us to see God in everything, to see Jesus in everything, what is beautiful in the world, what is beautiful in the stars, what is beautiful in the colors, beautiful in the trees, what's beautiful in man, is to see really Jesus. So faith and science, faith and intelligence are not opposite, are the same way. Nature and the supernatural are the same way. So it's important for the Church today to give also to the world this testimony of unity. We are not against the sciences. We want the real science. Sometimes what the science says against God is not science. It's not science. So we welcome the real sciences, and this is the testimony in the whole history of the Church. What did the Benedictine civilization took the best of the ancient civilization and gave to this civilization the sense of Jesus. What are to do we today? We must welcome the real sciences of our days and put it in this meaning, in this whole meaning of the creation. And of course, this is important for the material sciences, what is the world around us, but also for the sense of man. In our time, we have this great problem. We have learned to understand the importance of the world, and we have become really guardian of the nature, but sometimes we are not so really attentive to the man. We live in a time where we experience a great crisis of the sense of man, and this is a problem. In these days, it's really important what the world is saying, also in a very great voice for what happened in the United States with George Floyd, and this is very important to say to the world, to testimony, to witness in the world that also we as Christians, we have a sense of man which must go, must overcome all the discriminations. But I would like also to say, and I stop, and also to say, look, how many things are not seen also in this great testimony for the life. There are so many lives that are not respected. Figure up the lives of the children in the first moments in their lives, and are not so many people who go in the square to demonstrate for them. So the witness of the church must be really a total witness for the science, for the man, for the nature, for all lives, the lives of every skin, for the black lives, for the white lives, for the beginning lives, for the end of the life. Really, what Christ says to us as logos, as the sense of the science, that he is what gives value to all the aspect of the life and of the man. So looking at this Pope, we can pray Jesus as the Logos, and we say to him, Jesus, help us to understand what is the meaning of the creation, what is the meaning of our life, and let us be a real witness of the magnificence of God, which is expressed in all aspects of our life.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Your Excellency.
I mean, your remarks touch the fundamental points. We could think about them and talk about them all day. I'm a little worried that Bentz, Dr. Bentz, probably has a lot more to say about the Basilica. I don't think we're even half done, but we're already past 1 o'clock. But I do think...
Onward we continue, and we're going to cross the Basilica now, Bob, and we're going to go around the Baldacchino, and we're going to go to the tomb of Alexander the Seventh. And here we go, and as we...
Oh, that's... Alexander the Seventh must be distinguished from Alexander the Sixth.
Yes. Yes.
I once made that mistake. Oh, here's the cupola. And
And here, as we walk, we look up, we see the beautiful cupola and the top of the baldacchino, which last week we had just a wonderful explanation of the theology and the design of this baldacchino. So if you missed it, please go to the YouTube channel and you can hear Dr. Bentz's explanation. And now we continue on, and here we are. For those former pilgrims, they'll recognize this door. This is the door that we go in and out when we stay in the Doma Santa Marta. And at papal events, this is the door that the dignitaries, the cardinals, the diplomats will walk in as well, because it's just up by the baldacchino. When you're facing it, it's off to the left, as you saw in the map. So Jan, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Yes, we have come almost to the end of our itinerary, and so this will be the last stop, really. And so I picked another pope, as I said. I picked Pope Alexander VII, who incidentally finished the outside square of the basilica that we began with. So it's also a very good closing point, because he is the one that ultimately received us into the church with his beautiful colonnades designed by Bernini. Now, this monument is largely based on Bernini's design. We're talking about Gian Lorenzo Bernini, naturally the Baroque architect, the most important Baroque architect, the person really that defined the Baroque, who died in 1680. And so we have a funeral monument to his friend, we should say, Alexander VII. Now, Alexander VII commissioned Bernini with it. It was ultimately executed by another artist, Arrigo of San Marinto, but nonetheless, it is Bernini behind it. And so it's a beautiful memento mori. And I talked a little bit about death in the beginning, right? So dying to the world in baptism, and then also dying and realizing that the real life is just about to begin in the moment of death. And that is a great starting point when we look at this monument. Now, what the monument consists of is the Pope, obviously, Alexander VII, who reigned between 1655 and 1667, to give you a kind of a moment here in time, and who is in his own moment of death. This monument is different from all other papal monuments, papal monumental tombs in the Basilica, because it shows the Pope neither dead, so sleeping, nor blessing, nor Gregory the 13th was in this kind of grand motion. He was still blessing, but it's this kind of magnificent motion. But it shows the Pope praying. It shows the Pope praying. And so this is very important, because he is in the moment of death. And we can see that if we read the art, we can see that by looking at where he is located. He is located half in the dome of the side chapel. You remember what I told you, what white and gold signifies? Heaven. He is half in heaven, right? He's just cut just above the waist, right? Is already in heaven. The lower part is still on earth. He's in the moment of death, and he's in the pious moment of prayer, having his hands folded, universal sign of piety. So he's praying, he is thinking of, and he doesn't even wear his tiara. He is not wearing his papal crown. So he has left that behind. He's facing his judge as man, and he's praying about his about the meaning of his life. So it reminds us of our own moment of death. And so this is a beautiful Baroque scene, because what happens here is you'd have to imagine an imaginary curtain, right, covering this whole side chapel, covering this whole situation. And that curtain is the curtain that we have that separates us from God. We live our life, and there's a big curtain, as if we were on a stage, and behind us is a curtain, right? If you've ever been to a theater, you know that when the actors, when they're done playing, the curtain closes, and sometimes they come out and they bow in front of the audience. But so the curtain is behind us. We're looking around. We don't know what's going on. We're on this stage, in this world. We're on this stage. We're doing all of these things that people tell us to do, and we're like, well, but that's not That's not the guy who's writing the story of my life. That's not the guy who's directing my life. No, who is directing my life? And we never really get to meet the guy who directs our life. In the moment of death, we for the first time get to meet the screenwriter. We get to meet the guy that wrote our life, that invented us, as one of the personas in his great story, right? In his great glorious story, in this great, a story that is sometimes a tragedy, sometimes a drama, sometimes a comedy. And so we get to meet that guy. And this is the moment of the curtain fall. And this is exactly what happens here. The curtain fell. So Bernini doesn't put the curtain up, and he obviously cannot put it midair either. So he puts it down. It's in marble, so it's pretty heavy. It sank down, right? And so you see Alexander kneeling in the moment of his death before the curtain fall. And the curtain is on the ground, right? And is kind of couched between these four virtues. Right, so in the middle of it, and I think we have a closer shot, you can see that the curtain happens to also cover death, right? Right above the door, you have a skeleton with an hourglass. And it's a beautiful reminder that the face of death is covered. We do not know when death will reveal itself to us, but we do know that it will come, the hourglass. We are aware of time. We are aware that our time is running out. So, and Alexander VII was aware that his time was running out. So our best way of doing is get on our knees and talk to the screenwriter of our life, because that's the guy who we will face when the curtain falls. Now we have the four virtues, and I want to talk about two of them, the front ones, really briefly. The one on the left is charity, and charity is very easy to recognize. Charity is oftentimes portrayed as a mother holding her child, right? The ultimate sign of charity, of self-sacrifice. So that's on the left. Yep, there you go. Thank you. Perfect. So, and it's a pretty chubby child. So a very, very good, very charitable mother. And then on the other side, we have the allegory. No, go back, please. The allegory of faith. And so that is, yep, nope, that one's perfect. The next one, sorry. The one after, and one after. Perfect. Thank you. On the right, we see faith. Faith is embracing the Son of Truth, right? So she has the truth. She has the symbol of God, Son, the Son of Truth, in her by her chest, in her heart, right? So truth, the faith is the truth. But there is a very curious and again somewhat playful Baroque moment here that we have that Bernini included. And that is when we look at the foot of faith, because faith is standing on a globe, and the globe being, right, the faith being spread globally is a very important theme. We saw in the beginning the Trinity blessing the whole world, right? But now there is a thorn that comes out of one of the countries on that globe, poking faith in the big toe. And that country is England. And that thorn is the event, or the I guess the historical tragedy of the Anglican Church splitting with the Catholic Church, being a thorn in the foot of faith. I always love that. It's such a great little playful moment, right? So the whole world, and then you have that kind of poking the faith in her big toe. So yeah, many of these monuments have details of this nature, but I just wanted to point it out. But in general, I think what we can take away from this is a beautiful memento mori. It shows the piety of the Pope. It shows the piety of Bernini as well, and it reminds us ourselves that this world is not all that there is, and this is something that is a hopeful message. Sometimes it's also a sad message, because it means that our earthly life will end, but it is also a hopeful message because we will get to meet the screenwriter of our life. And that should be a moment of glory, as the Pope.
Yeah, Dan, yeah, and that's a bit of discrimination against England, I think you just said, but we'll have to start protesting. But but I was thinking just very briefly, that time clock is just so important, isn't it, for all of our lives? Often we see saints with I think St. Francis too, depicted as a skull in his hand, and it's not something morbid. Many people think it's very morbid, but it's really the truth about our lives. You know, the Psalm says our years are 70 or 80 for those who are strong, They pass swiftly and then we fly away. And the whole point is to live this life well. Live it well because eternity awaits us. And, you know, this life is short, eternity is long. And so we have everything to play for in this life.
Beautiful. Well, I think we're now at the point where we're going to visit our last saint. And I think it's so poignant that we visit the saint that Father Tony just referred to, the one who is shown sometimes holding a skull, and also the one who we know is also saying Sister Death. And so, of course, that is St. Francis. And St. Francis's statue is near the chair of Peter. So we leave just to the left of the baldacchino, and we walk behind it, and we go to the altar of the chair. And here's where we find ourselves. And of course, there is the statue there of St. Francis there on the left. Jan?
Yes, thank you. So we've approached the same place that we ended our first part. We approached it from a different route. So I guess that gives you multiple viewpoints of the same thing. And there you have St. Francis with his cross in hand. Remember, the cross and the vision from the cross really made a beginning of Francis' life. And then he has the rule of his of the fratres minor, so the little brothers, the Franciscans, what then gets to enter history as the Franciscans in his hand. Now, Francis, I think, is the symbol of the ultimate pilgrim, really, and that's why I wanted to end here, because we're on a pilgrimage ultimately, and all of these works of art and all of these parts of this church invite us to meditate the faith deeper. And I think Francis is a great example of that, a person who recognized that our earthly pilgrimage ultimately leads to God, and who really tried to conform his whole life to that, to preaching the good news about that pilgrimage. But he also took all of the hardship of the pilgrimage on himself. Right? On a pilgrimage, you don't really have much luggage. You don't really have, you know, whatever you can only carry on your own body, really, and you don't really have possession, right? You have your staff possibly, and you maybe have shoes, and those will eventually break down as well, so you have to go barefoot. And so Francis, I think, is a beautiful example of a pilgrim. And since we have the Bishop of Assisi here, it was the perfect pick, so I had to do it. So there you got St. Francis, and that's what I want to end on. So maybe someone can say a closing word, and thank you for your attention. I've tested your patience a little bit here by going over time, but I hope it's
no problem, Jan. This has been beautiful. We're going to just continue, and we perhaps can even ask for the intercession of St. Francis as we continue down. And again, this is just a close-up of
the rule.
Right, of the rule he was holding in his hand. He is holding in his hand, and we go around the baldacchino again. And for those who were with us last week, you'll remember that we go into the column, and that is the easiest access once you're inside the basilica to go to the crypt. And we're going to go below the baldacchino into the crypt where we will find the tomb of Peter. And this is one side of the tomb, and now this is the very tiny chapel that is just on the opposite side of what we saw. And it is here where we will end in prayer at the tomb. And I'd like for Your Excellency, Archbishop Sorrentino, if you would please lead us in a concluding prayer at the tomb of Peter.
Yes. Peter, you are the rock of the church. So Jesus wanted you looking at your faith that is weak with our faith, but is the faith which Jesus supports in the centuries, in the history. Jesus is behind you, and Jesus accompany you in your historic life as the basis of the church, and in the successors of you, like in our time, Pope Francis. We want to to stay with you as rock, as stone of the church. We know that you represent for us Jesus, and we welcome Jesus, receiving him from your hands, Peter. And we want to do it with the faith of Saint Francis. At his time, like in our time, Peter expressed also the weakness, but he used to look inside the grace of God, inside the power of God. So we want to receive from you also the hope for our church in a time of crisis that we must admit. But we know, like for Peter in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, that Jesus is there. Jesus is there. Sometimes it looks a little bit as he sleeps, but Jesus never sleeps because he loves his church. So ultimately, Jesus is to you our prayer. With Peter, with the successor of Peter, we want to look at you, Jesus, at you in the Transfiguration, to look at you on the cross, to look to you in the resurrection. Jesus, you are the rock, you are the stone on which our life is founded. We praise you, Jesus. We love you, Jesus. We adore you, Jesus, with the church, with Peter, with the successor of Peter, the concrete successor of Peter of our times, Pope Francis. Amen.